So as it turns out, creating a game by yourself requires a lot of polishing. And that's currently what we're doing. So before I show off our next big milestone, let's talk about developing a dark fantasy RPG. One of the first things I decided when creating this game was to focus probably 90% of my effort on the gameplay itself and building that specifically. Story and art and level design can wait, in my opinion, if I don't have a foundation of a game actually built yet. But with that being said, those things really are kind of what makes a game come together in the end. So while I'm under the hood kind of arguing with myself over how much camera shake I should have when the player hits a target, let's talk about building a fantasy world. Many people have a particular game, I think, that comes to mind when they think dark fantasy. It could be Dark Souls, Warhammer Fantasy, or a number of other, worlds and titles. But the challenge that I think I faced was really, how do I create one that's my own? What separates one fantasy world from another? Is it the characters, the world itself, or the events and the conflicts that happen within it? And after a lot of storyboarding and brainstorming and letting the water get cold, thinking about it in the shower, I came to the conclusion that the first thing that a fantasy world or a game needs to separate itself is the world itself. And I decided to make my world a world of consequences. A world where all power has its price, so to speak. The background of my game and the world it takes place in is marked by both power and the cost to those who wield it. When trying to create world building, I actually looked at a lot of real world history for inspiration for some of the events that took place before kind of the player gets their hands on the player character. I feel like that actually makes some of the events feel more believable when they are kind of an allegory for kind of historical events or historical wars that have actually happened. When the player gets their hands on the character, the story is kind of they're the last knight of a destroyed order, a novice that should currently be learning from veterans, but they've all perished. They find themselves in a world that's kind of beset on all sides by otherworldly monsters that were brought into the world, by the very people whose pride and desperation for power invited them to the world in the first place. And through this kind of folly, they created petty lords and beings out of their control. And now they have to enlist the help of these knightly orders, skilled in harnessing the entropic powers of the entities against them. Now, how will this ultimately reflect in the gameplay, I think is the major question. The player and the knights, the companions who fight beside them, will have at their disposal some stolen power from the entities they fight. This may be the power, over death or the undead, or even a command over the elements. The plan is to keep the scope tight on this, but to make sure each character kind of has a specific gameplay function and an identity that is also reflected in some of the enemies they face. The hope is that both the player and their squad of companion knights will be able to work off each other in a way that will ultimately promote more of a strategic use of their combat abilities. With all that said, my focus remains almost solely on gameplay and making sure that the core loop of the game gets to a rock solid place before I move on. And though it is very fun to talk about the world and the story of the game, there needs to be a game first. If you would like to hear more about the specifics of the story of the game, or even want me to go into kind of my outline plans for the game's art direction or the level design, leave a comment. I can expand on it more in another video. And let me know if you enjoyed this more kind of in-depth and less structured look at the game. I'm happy to do more of these alongside the regular devlogs, especially if people have topics that they'd like me to dig deeper into. But for now, it's back to tuning and polishing. Stick around. Next time we're going to look at our polished systems and the new tactical pause and command system for our companions.